Hello, everybody. First of all, let me say I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Marika, for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, especially as back in September 1975, the National Museum hosted an exhibition of graphic works accompanying the ICA Congress. Now the exhibition called Information and Emotion included a manifestation of Konieczny's Think Crazy strategy. Possibly it was a Think Crazy flag or a metal banner. It's impossible to ascertain that at this point. So let me tell you briefly about Konieczny. He started off as a Warsaw-based engineer working with the internationally acclaimed Polish architects such as Jerzy Sołtan and Oskar Hansen, who intended to offer a more humanized, modified version of architectural modernism. Now, Konieczny graduated back in 1961 from Gliwice IT in southern Poland with a degree in civil and industrial engineering, specializing in building materials and technologies of prefabrication. And he also shown an interest at that point in curved tensile surfaces. This is something that is going to kind of recur as a motif in his work. So following his studies at Warsaw's Academy of Fine Arts, since the mid-1960s, Konieczny began working as an artist. Over the years, the artist passed through a series of incredible metamorphoses, embarking on a journey through geometric abstraction, so it was throughout the 60s until 1968, conceptual art manifestos between 1969 and 71, Fluxus actions between 68 and 70, generation of random, aleatory or stochastic situations, circa 1970 and 1971. He also embarked on performance art starting from 1971, mail art from 1972, body art from 1974, installations from 1974, video art in 1975, metal reliefs and textures paintings. You have a little sample of this here, starting from 1976, as well as woodwork and furniture design starting from 1981. So you see it's quite a lot. It's really unbelievable the amount of different kind of art media that he has passed through since the 1960s. Around 1974, so this is this guy here. Around 1974, Konieczny formulated, or better still, fabulated a unique artistic idiom, his signature art strategy called Think Crazy, that gave consistency to all the above disparate experimentations. It was an affirmation of change that traverses and brings together heterogeneous dimensions. Now, the goal of my dissertation was precisely to attend to qualitative change in Konieczny's art, as simultaneously, first of all, a variation in expressive materials, and secondly, a sort of ethology of cultures. So, thus affirming what the Deleuzian scholar and Sauvagnard called art as a monument that is inseparable from the complex forces into which it is taken, unquote. Now, as I understand it, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of demonstrate it and substantiate it a bit as well, Think Crazy affirms a radical future of non-human materials and unforeseen metamorphoses of the human, and at once an anomalous involution entailing an untimely relation with the 17th century Polish hybrid orientalized art and culture of the gentry. So this was called Sarmatism, but for my purposes, I used the notion that I coined Sarmato-Baroque. Now, for the purpose of my dissertation, I understand Sarmato-Baroque as a kind of fabulation of the nomadic steppe lineage of the gentry, with a composition of Turkic, vernacular, and Western elements that included Gothic, Mannerist, and Baroque style as well. So just a little kind of overview of my presentation here. Hopefully I'll have time to tackle all those points. So this is going to be really philosophical, so it's just a disclaimer, it's going to be really kind of philosophical approach. So first of all, I'm going to tackle this kind of question of researching the neo-avant-garde and the problems we are facing. And I'll be able to offer my insights from my unique vantage point of attending to Marek Konieczny. So I cannot make any claims, obviously, for neo-avant-garde kind of in general, but this is some sort of point of view activated in my encounter with Konieczny. And this logic of encounter is something that I would like to propose as a, I suppose, research modality that is kind of has proven really fruitful for me with engaging with this complicated artwork of Marek Konieczny. So first of all, this kind of question, first problem that I was dealing with is the question of epistemological and institutional marginalization of Konieczny as part of the neo-avant-garde. Secondly, this kind of more ontological question, what is, or perhaps how is the neo-avant-garde? And then what is the ontological status of performance documentation? Then, if I have time, I'll share with you a couple of field notes, so to speak. So basically narrating my experience of working with archives, touching upon the role of accounts of art encounters and artist statements as well. And hopefully I'll be able to finish it off with a conclusion and proposing this kind of logic of encounter that has surfaced through my work with Konieczny's material. So first of all, let me start with the fact that Konieczny has been marginalized in the Polish mainstream art history and institutions. So there are only scarce mentions existing, including, amongst others, those by Jerzy Kwiński and Stefan Murawski in the 1970s, Alicja Kępińska in the 1980s, important analyses by Monika Szwajewska in the 1980s. And well, that's pretty much it in terms of like more in-depth or comprehensive analyses. It was not until Łukasz Ronduda's 2007 pictogram article that was kind of reprinted in the lavishly illustrated 2009 coffee table album co-authored by Ronduda and the Polish artist Piotr Uklański that promised to reverse this trend and reclaim Konieczny's art. So imagine there's been so many years, and in the meantime, really nothing has happened, not until 2007. It's kind of really interesting, this 29 coffee table album publication co-authored by Ronduda and Uklański features a still from Konieczny's short film Santa Conversazione on its cover. So you can see the actual film. It's a kind of short-looped film. It's not more than 1 minute. I don't know if I remember correctly, doesn't matter. But anyway, now Ronduda's article offers, however, a cursory look at Konieczny's work. And his article was largely based on Konieczny's 1986 exhibition catalog, featuring a chronological overview of his activity written by Konieczny's partner, Monika Szwajewska. Now, A reason behind this marginalization of Konieczny was his designation as one of many artists, amongst many artists, belonging to the so-called pseudo-avant-garde. Now, what it was, basically, it was a derogative term coined in 1975 by the art critic Wiesław Borowski in an article that launched vitriolic essentialist critique of a wide array of diverse neo-avant-garde practices that were deemed not properly avant-gardist and, on a more general note, more of a cultural than an artistic phenomenon. But there was something interesting in Borowski's otherwise ill-conceived diagnosis. They had been mounting for some time since the beginning of the 1970s and encouraged minor avant-garde, and I mean this term minor in a kind of affirmative sense. And this avant-garde occupied an uncertain place between the historical avant-garde, modernism, and, to quote Ronduda, conceptualism and pragmatism. So the narrative of the discursive institutional exclusion of the neo-avant-garde actually gets even more complicated in case of Konieczny, because simply in following Think Crazy and its play of chance, the artist programmatically kept his distance. So selectively attaching himself to diverse art events and projects, embarking on productive fabulations, zigzagging across art history, so to speak. And furthermore, Konieczny has always enjoyed the ongoing support of alternative art institutions in Poland in the 70s, such as Lublin's Galeria Labyrinth. So perhaps I'll skip to the other problem. The nagging problem for me is what's the ontological status of the neo-avant-garde, because we are talking neo-avant-garde, avant-garde, but obviously it merits some clarification of terms. Now, according to the Polish aesthetician Stefan Murawski, the diverse, wholly, I quote, the diverse, wholly extra-artistic matter becomes the substance of the creative endeavors and achievements of the neo-avant-garde. Choices are now made beyond art, which some researchers soundly designate as the end of the sensu stricto avant-garde. So basically, there's this idea of opening art to reality. It was taken up by Ronduda, who basically takes I'm going to show you the Ronduda's classification of art. Oh yeah, that's the one. So this is the classification that Ronduda came up with. And it's kind of really interesting that, he leaves out what he kind of designates as traditional art out of the equation, and he does not specify what does this traditional art even mean. But I have come to realize that there's actually a very different niche way of understanding the neo-avant-garde, one that actually helps account for the persistent difficulty confronted by all its researchers. Now, according to the art critic, the prominent art historian Jerzy Ludwiński, the breakthrough year of 1970 in a Polish context functions as a sort of caesura that announces the end of history as we know it and launches the ahistorical so-called implosive art, dismantling the unitary notion of avant-garde. And previously, avant-garde was kind of conceptualized as yet another stage in linear art evolution, made up of mutually exclusive, separate, and sharply delineated stages. So he makes it really clear in his kind of diagram. So you have like those sequences, you travel from stage of object and then onto the zero stage. But for him, what happened in 1970 destroyed this model of sequentiality itself. So what's at stake here is a more fundamental dismantling of avant-garde. So this is, Yeah, so this moment of explosion of unitary model of the avant-garde. There's a more fundamental dismantling of the avant-garde predicated upon the unitary model of art as a priori anchor against which, in the name of which, the conquest of non-artistic reality could be made. So, that's how Lutwiński visualizes the avant-garde. So avant-garde is always ahead of art, on the outside border of art, facing and pulverizing the non-artistic. So it's like some sort of bulldozer that's kind of bulldozes everything kind of around it. So, and this is called the progressive expansion of the field of art. So in turn, this kind of new art that came to be in 1970, that he turned called implosive art. Not avant-garde, he called this not avant-garde, not new avant-garde, but underground art or implosive art. It possesses an ethical and ecological dimension because it does not conquer the world and its transcendent operator, but is rather an involution that immanently, non-violently affirms and protects the world. And while it can only be sensed and is akin to imperceptible seismic murmurs, it nonetheless disrupts, productively blurs the fixed order of time and space by introducing transversal trans-historical connections. So this is kind of really interesting thing happening here because we are encroaching upon Nietzsche's proper terrain, the question of the untimely, unhistorical. So this is a point of marked convergence between Lutwiński and Nietzsche. Those kind of transversal connections, basically what is remote in metric space and linear time becomes a single folded topological surface. So obviously you can see that, those kind of covering distance over time, making those kind of direct connections across time. This is precisely something that Ronduda leaves out, and he designates this kind of traditional art. Like, for example, Christian art or, I don't know, Baroque art is always traditional, but he does not really attend to the way in this implosive model there could be some transversal connections to be made, and there actually were in the case of Konieczny. So basically, looking from the perspective of 1981, Lutwiński notices that the 1970s saw recuperation of tendencies that were previously considered traditional. Unquote, he sees a marked resurgence of interest in pre-modern art, in art publications, and the paradoxical situation whereby, I quote, and this is my translation, what garners the most interest are the kinds of art most removed in time and space, barely comprehensible to us. So, in this context, we could see Konieczny's Think Crazy. Not many people know about this, but Think Crazy is indissolubly tied to Konieczny's encounter of the Golden Age Dutch painting in Amsterdam, as well as his interest in the 17th century Polish provincial portraits. You can see them to the left there. And a point of curiosity, it was an art medium that was a cross between Netherlandish gilt painting, Byzantine art, and Oriental aniconic ornamentation. Obviously, this new implosive art requires a new type of art analysis. And Lutwiński proposes here what I call the genetic method. And I quote Lutwiński again, while previously the focus was placed on form, the semblance of art, now one has to dig deep inside those artistic phenomena, reach to their sources out of which they grew, to extract them as if there were roots or better still with the soil attached to them. So basically, he is in a point of convergence with Deleuze's methods when he's basically talking about this analysis that he's proposing is some sort of analysis of the virtual implicit conditions that have given rise to an artistic fact. So Lutwiński handily visualizes such procedure as X-raying of a mountain of art to see the varied multiple zones of virtual transhistorical sources indissoluble from its milieu. So I think that this diagram illustrates that you need to kind of understand an art manifestation as this kind of complex interface of forces, and there's this kind of question marks, there's this kind of virtual potentiality that you are kind of drawing out. So if I still have time, or do I Oh yeah, 5 minutes. So I want to tell you also briefly about the question of the ontological status of performance documentation, because I believe this is something that always comes up when researching the 70s neo-avant-garde with its really ephemeral materials. Now Konieczny sources have real uncertain ontological status. As my external examiner of my PhD, Professor David Crowley, remarked, looking at the photographs included in Konieczny's documentation, we don't know what we are looking at. If we are looking at a performers or a documentation of one, frequently it is impossible to ascertain the genre, material, time, and audiences of a performance. So basically there's a kind of, we don't know almost like anything about, I'd say, 80% of those art manifestations, so to speak. David suggested that I develop a more in-depth catalogue raisonné that at the same time draws attention to the problematic status of those materials. And also, I was to include my own speculations as well, because this kind of speculation upon art is some element of resonance that, this is kind of what art has to offer as well, so this kind of speculative edge. Konieczny himself perceives the process of documenting this material incorporeal art through photographs and exhibition catalogs as an art practice. So this resonates with Konieczny's understanding of art, and so this is really interesting, as encapsulated in Peter Sanderden's painting that Konieczny also saw in the Netherlands. So this painting, encounter with this painting, kind of created this kind of qualitative change within Konieczny with respect to this, the whole project of art, so to speak. So now for Konieczny kind of art, and this is based on this very painting, is nothing else but a technology of documentation of abstraction, of something that does not necessarily have to be a reality. So what he's saying basically, and I made some kind of zoom on details for those, because it's kind of really interesting. This is what Konieczny was focusing about, this kind of disproportionately large column in this painting. That's, for him, it's like a passage into abstraction. So we can say that in this vision, the technical plane cannot be separated from the plane of aesthetic composition. So what's at stake is kind of all materials becoming expressive. So let me illustrate what I mean by this. So I describe this photo in my catalogue raisonné, and I describe this photograph as follows. A reproduction of a color photograph documenting Konieczny's body art performance in the artist's studio. The performance involves Konieczny holding a gilded sickle between his thighs. So there isn't any further information on audiences. There's no way of knowing for sure what it is, what the image is or represents. But at the same time, this image encapsulates Konieczny's peculiar vision of art's operation that can be aptly characterized also aptly characterizes research on the neo-avant-garde. So what this image is a material operation of forces that modulates the spectator and the work. It is an encounter with the outside that deforms and qualitative changes the stable anchors of the body art genre, predicated on the idea of my lived body inserted into linear time and space. So it's kind of really interesting. Just with this kind of simple, this photograph, he already kind of qualitatively changes, you know, the notion what philosophically what body art kind of even means within art historical discourse. Because basically, body art is the notion of the body is predicated on some sort of, I don't know, phenomenological understanding of the body. So for him, body is a sort of interface of forces. Archival visits, another story. It's a long story in Polish institutions. For me, from my experience, the archival visits, it's not just a question of content, but getting a sense of the materiality of the materials and the modes in which they partake in an economy of power relations and also some sort of human forces of the outside. So even within this situation here, we are just not documenting, but it's basically a complex of forces of light in photography, because obviously the photograph was taken, and the processes of digital mediation, motor forces of the hand that was supporting, that was holding the artwork, so I can, you know, take a photograph, and then finally this kind of legal issues surrounding the archival visit. So, so that would be, you know, this. A way of fragmenting this kind of encounter, which is not really so much about documenting, but this kind of assemblage of forces when this kind of hand that comes up, appears from out of nowhere, makes it possible for me to take a photograph. This is the most salient in curating ephemera, such as Konieczny's mental actions from the 1970s, that thematize this material incorporeal transmission. So basically, it's a little kind of foil that says on the 23rd January 1974, about 7 p.m., I will transmit you a signal. So it's really kind of perishable, so to speak. So. You know, how do you create that? You know, you cannot disattach, you know, this kind of abstract classification with your actual encounter with this kind of little, you know, assemblage. Also briefly, I think accounts of encounters, other people's encounters with Konieczny's work were important for me. And also, I would affirm against this, you know, claims of death of the author, actually paying attention to the artist's accounts of his creative process as some sort of an ecology of practices in the sense of Isabelle Stonger. So it's really important that you need to forge a relation with the artist and trust the artist. So those two methods would complement scarce secondary sources and misleading primary sources. And in fact, Marek Konieczny frequently incorporated accounts of encounters with his works into catalogs of his exhibitions to suggest that the work is a radiation across the viewer and the work, a work of sensation that puts the viewer and materials into resonance. And just one last thing, I met with Marek yesterday. He was really sorry, but he could not make it today, but he asked that I read out this text with a commentary that this text, originally written in 1992, has gained now a kind of real validity in this contemporary context. So there should be no such thing as the cultural policy of the state. One should eradicate the domination of the state over culture. Art and culture are born out of individuality, and such is their sole genealogy. Art as individuality, culture as individuality. Thank you for your attention.